Welcome to the Reiver podcast, part of Elysium's Reiver Voices from the Borders initiative, a new writing project taking place in schools across Durham and Northumberland County this year. Recorded with the generous support of the National Heritage Lottery Fund, Northumberland County Council and Durham University, we look at different aspects of the Reiver era and discuss approaches to creative writing. I'm Jake Murray, Artistic Director of Elysium Theatre Company, and with me is writer and actor Steve Byron. Steve, thanks for doing this. So tell us, who were the Reivers and how did you first become interested in them?
The Reivers were families that lived on the Anglo-Scottish borders between the 13th and 17th century. At the time, those lands were known as the debatable lands because they were sometimes owned by England, sometimes owned by Scotland, and sometimes owned by neither. And they were kind of like left to their own devices. They were caught between many, many wars and many, many battles, and they had to basically build themselves to look after themselves, basically to become kind of like powerful figures. So what they would do is they would take over land and they would steal from each other and they would build from each other and they would take from anybody and anything to kind of keep themselves going. This wasn't something that happened over a short period of time. We're talking about 400 years this went on over. There were big families, there were small families. There was something that the governments and the monarchy at the time, the kings and the queens, they were quite feared of. They kind of used them to kind of fight their battles for them and at times gave them power to run the land itself. You'd sometimes find that a family would, one year they'd be in power and looking after the community, and the next they were taking from the community and they would be wanted people. And the reason they were called Reivers, the word Reivers, is it means raiders. So they were constantly raiding from each other and anyone else, taking cattle, livestock, demanding money, protection rackets, basically a precursor to your Wild West, the precursor to what you would call your gangsters. They kind of like lived that lifestyle and They kind of had to live that lifestyle to survive, because if you didn't become strong, then you wouldn't survive. So many families would align themselves with each other. They'd come together and form bigger families, and they would form alliances together and look after each other. But those alliances would often crumble or fall apart. So again, families, maybe the best of friends one day, but then the worst of enemies the next, depending on what was going on for them. The way I became interested with them, I'm originally from kind of central South Northumberland. I'm from an area known as Tynedale in Northumberland, specifically a market town called Hexham. And there was kind of like a little bit of history about the Reivers around. The thing about the Reivers is it's for such a big part of history, not a lot of people actually know about. So I kind of like had some little inklings of what they were. And I'd heard little bits about them because a lot of activity had happened in the area where I was growing up. So I had a bit of an inkling about it. And then I had an idea probably about 10 years ago to create, it was originally going to be a modern story, but based around the idea of these Reivers. But the more I kind of delved into the history of it and the more that I kind of found things out, I just kind of went, but it's all there. There's so many adventures here. There's so much. These stories are so rich, and they're about the people around me. The history of so many people around me. And if you're fortunate to have one of the 30 to 40 surnames that are kicking around in the northeast, then chances are you're from Reiver stock originally, going back hundreds of years. You were part of these clans that kind of ran riot for hundreds of years. And over the last few years, being able to now write stories about the Reivers and kind of create tales, I've become a bit obsessed by it. When I hear of a new legend or a piece of history, I guess, if I find a piece of history and I go, oh, that's really good. And what I'm not doing is I'm not writing history. I'm not just taking facts that happened and turning them into drama. I'm taking a concept and I'm rewriting it. So I'm using a little bit of fact and then a little bit of imagination, if you like, because I wasn't there. So I don't know the exact ins and outs of what happened. And for me as a storyteller, it's something that I want to get it from the angle of the people who were involved and not just from a historical point of view. I'm kind of like interested in what it must have been like to kind of live and be part of that society that was around, and to kind of all of that. It just grows and grows and grows, and everywhere you go, I even look at the county differently now. So when I'm traveling across the county, I look at the fields and I look at the moorlands and I look at the hills and I look at everything, and I see it with an almost a different eye than I have done for the last 50 years of my life. It's kind of like you can just see it. So that's my fascination with the news. I think it's such a big story, and again, it's something not a lot of people know about, and yet it's such an important story. You know, it's a story about good, bad. It's about resilience. It's about hope. It's about betrayals. It's about the light and the dark within storytelling. You know, it's just, you know, I've read some stories that are just really, really funny, but then I've read some stories that are really, really dark and really, really tragic. So yeah, I just find the whole thing really, really exciting.
So you mentioned the 30 or so Reiver names. Tell us a little bit more about that, and maybe a little bit about some of the kind of major players of the Reiver families.
Okay, within any county there are names, and there would have been. Over the time with the growth of the Reivers, these names, the families would grow, you know, either over time or people would align themselves to certain families, you know, and I'm going to say some names now. In fact, I've got a book here, and what I'll do is I'll read you, if I can find them, I'll read you all the names in this book. And then anyone who's listening to it, they're guaranteed either it might be their name or they're going to know someone with this name, especially if they're from this neck of the woods. If they're from the northeast of England, they're going to know them, okay? I'll try and do it as quickly and efficiently as I possibly can. Here we go. So from A to Y, we have Archibald, Armstrong, Beatty, Bell, Burns, Carlton, Carlisle, Carnaby, Cars, Carruthers, Chamberlain, Charlton, Collingwood, Crisp, Crozier, Cuthbert, Durst, Davison, Dixon, Dodd, Douglas, Dunn, Elliott, Fenwick, Foster, Graham, Gray, Hull, Headley, Henderson, Heron, Hetherington, Hume, Irving, Irvin, Johnston, Kerr, Lidlow, Little, Lunlier, Maxwell, Milburn, Musgrove, Nixon, Noble, Ogle, Oliver, Potts, Pringle, Radcliffe, Reed, Ridley, Robinson, Routledge, Rutherford, Solid, Scott, Selby, Shafto, Story, Simpson, Taylor, Tate, Trotter, Turnbull, Wake, Watson, Wilson, Woodrington, Yarrow, Young. Okay, so there's the names. I mean, there'll be more. There's a few more, but they're your key names. Of them, there were families that gained so much notoriety. They became such big, powerful families, and those were your Armstrongs, your Robsons, your Charltons, your Grahams, your Fenwicks. These were all probably the larger ones of the family. So if I missed anyone's names out and they know they were a big Reiver family, I apologise. But within that, the smaller families would align themselves to them because it would give them power as well. And also it would give them protection. You know, if you were affiliated to an Armstrong family, you know you wouldn't get robbed by the Armstrongs, if that makes sense. If you were affiliated to the Robsons would not. You'd be safe, you know. So we're talking about big protection rackets. But obviously, within this, there were feuds. So it's like, if you were affiliated to the Johnstons, you needed to stay away from the Maxwells because the Johnstons and the Maxwells had a huge feud. And if you were aligned to one family, you were open game from the other. Does that make sense? It's brutal. It's warfare on a small scale. You know, even though at the same time they were all embroiled in the Anglo-Scottish wars that were going on for the hundreds of years. So they had the national wars and battles, and they had their own little feuds and battles as well. In fact, they weren't little; some of them were huge. I have to say, because some of these families involved thousands upon thousands of soldiers. We're not talking about like, you know, a gang of a dozen lads went round kicking off. We're talking about they could muster in a short space of time hundreds of soldiers.
So how did the authorities deal with them and try and keep them in check?
Well, they tried lots of different strategies. The area of the borders, what they did was they broke them up into different districts, and they were known as the marches. So you had the North March, the South March, the East March, and the West March, all those marches. And they were kind of given to kind of people to look after. So whether it was people within the government or people within the monarchy to look after, but then they would often then kind of sublet these jobs to the families to do. So the bigger families would be given the role of looking over that part of land and having that responsibility of looking over that part of the land. So they kind of would give them power. So they didn't have to look after them. It was kind of like, well, we'll just let them look after themselves. Occasionally they would encourage these feuds because they just wanted them to wipe themselves out because they were literally forced to be reckoned with. They were uncontrollable. And, you know, yeah, they sent their armies in, occasionally to wipe them out, and they did on these scales, but they would come back. They were hundreds upon hundreds of executions of these Reiver clans, on a huge scale, but they would come back. So basically, it was an area that if they didn't have to deal with the land, they just didn't deal with the land. But obviously, what was going on the bigger scale within government and within monarchy is they had to deal with these lands. But they would also hire them to be their soldiers. So they kind of money played a big deal. People were given titles, people were given power, they were given lands to keep an eye on everything, just to keep it in order. But I guess once a Reiver, always a Reiver. Why bow down to a king or a queen if you are the king and queen of your own land? And I think that's what went on. And, often nobility would come to the land and talk to them. And often they would be sent packing on many occasions. The only way it finally came to an end, because this would have gone on, was when Scotland and England kind of came together with when Elizabeth died, and James VI of Scotland also then became James I of both England and Scotland. So basically the lands kind of fell under one sovereignty and under one kind of governmental body. And a lot of the Reivers went, okay, we better move on. And they packed up or were sent off, and they, to begin with, they all moved off to Ireland. And not long after that, they all ventured further west to the Americas. And, you listen to some of them names that I've mentioned in that list, and there's a lot of famous names in America who have those surnames.
Nixon, Armstrong, Graham.
Yeah, some for good things, some for bad things. You can kind of go the corrupt president known as Nixon, or probably the most famous Armstrong, basically took over a piece of land that no one else had even stood on before. The moon could be deemed as Reiver territory.
So you mentioned that they, as well as being outlaws and kind of uncontrollable by the monarchs, sometimes they fought for them because they were great warriors and also great horsemen, weren't they? But they didn't ride horses, is that correct?
The horses, or the ponies rather, that they used were really small. The breed of horse, which it doesn't come to my mind anymore, it's extinct now. But they used to ride these tiny little things because they could really shift these horses because they were so small. They could move really fast. But they were kind of because of the nature of the land, they wouldn't necessarily use the horses in battle. Do you know what I mean? They would use them if they were traveling long distances to kind of go to Reiver, and to kind of herd whatever they'd stolen back. But they were kind of as far as they land soldiers, kind of and on massive numbers. The thing with these battles is that, everybody knew they were going to happen. There must have been an interesting sight to see that, two encampments would arrive in an area and they know they're going to fight. They're just waiting for the instruction to do it. And sometimes it would be over days, possibly even weeks, where they could possibly see in the distance another encampment, knowing that, waiting for the instruction that they're going to have to go in and fight, and weaponry at its time was kind of really moving on. The invention of muskets and the use of firepower rather than kind of handheld weapons and bows and arrows and crossbows. We're moving into a new era with that as well. So battles were fought in many, many different ways, depending on what weaponry they had and what they did. Different tactics were used. Sometimes battles weren't, they weren't as straightforward, and there'd be people lying in wait. They'd be hiding. You might go into battle with what you think is going to be 300 men, but what you don't know is the top of the hill. There's another 600 hiding behind a massive bush.
They were famous for ambushes, weren't they?
Oh, totally. For example, I mentioned the Maxwell Johnson thing, so that happened in Dryford Sands in southwest Scotland. So basically, at the time the Maxwells were in power, and they were kind of aligned to the governmental body, and they basically, Maxwell at the time, the head of the Maxwell family, was given instruction, bring Johnson in and he will go to trial. At one point, many years beforehand, Johnson, he'd ruled it. He kind of held government. He was a body of power there. But at the time, he was an outlaw. So what happened was the Maxwells, he mustered a load of soldiers. He had a lot of money and a lot of power. So in a very short space of time, he'll have put out, I have this amount of money per man. And I think he offered pieces of land as well. So basically, within no time at all, he had, let's just assume, I think it was about a couple of thousand men. They then marched from Carlisle to Dryford Sands. Word had obviously got to the Johnsons that they were coming. But when the Maxwells arrived, they met the Johnsons, didn't seem to be that many, and the Maxwells thought this is going to be really easy. But what the Johnsons did was they kind of just shouted swear words at them to get them to come and get them. And when they went in to get them, there were about another 3,000 men in hiding, and the ambush was set. And they obviously chased the Maxwells into Lockerbie, and that's where the massacre came, that massacre that we talk about in one of our stories.
Yeah, that features in a godforsaken place. And I think there were a number of big sackings, weren't there? Because in another one of your pieces, Widow's Path, Edinburgh is burnt to the ground.
That was something that was, that was before Elizabeth, when her father was in reign, Henry VIII. And obviously this is the other politics that's going on, is religion. This is something, when Henry kind of came to the throne, he kind of brought about what was seen as a new religion, and he wanted that religion enforced upon things, and that moved him further up into Scotland, and what he decided he was doing all the time. But obviously, again, also alliances with other countries, because at the time, Henry was at battle, at times with Spain or France, and yet Scotland would have alliances with Spain and France. Do you know what I mean? So there was so many of the big picture. So what happened within The Widow's Path was the story of a young girl who was living in Edinburgh at the time, and it was the time when Henry VIII sent his naval ships in and basically bombed and destroyed Edinburgh, and she found herself homeless, and she lost all her family, and she was kind of living within a war zone, and then got herself out of that war zone and found herself down in the borders, where she met up with a family who were kind of part of that culture as well. But she found a family and she found home, and then obviously within that story, what happens within that story. So what I try to use is some of the bigger picture stories within the smaller stories that I'm telling. So I might use them as a background, or I might use them to kind of bring focus on how involved these people were in some of the big politics of the time and what was going on.
But you can still see some of the architecture, can't you? The Peel Towers and the Keep.
Yeah, they're still standing today, going back to the families that moved to the Americas, their descendants. They travel in their hundreds to come and visit these homes and these towers and these defences, because of these battles and because of the way they lived their lives and having to protect their own land. They built these tall stone towers, some of them 4 meters thick of stone. All this stone, by the way, is stolen from the Roman wall, so they paid for nothing. Why buy stone when you can steal it? But they built these huge towers that are still standing today, and if you travel across parts of Northumberland and Cumbria and, kind of across the borders, or even down toward, you can go as far down into Durham and County Durham, as you see these old fortresses that were used, and they would house these families of hundreds all the time, and really strong looking stone buildings. And someone quoted them as saying, it's like, if anyone could make a building that says go away, that's not what they said, but it's what I'm going to say. That building would say that. If you look at the Reiver buildings, they're basically saying go away.
So tell us a little bit about the women in the Reiver era, because they could be very powerful too, couldn't they?
Well, of course. I mean, they were just as influential, just as strong, and, they kind of ran the families. And as we all know, within the world, it's the women who really run things. We all know that. They might not be directly involved with some of the battles and some of the raiding, but they would be there to kind of make sure that the family was kept in order and to keep them safe and to keep them fed. And, the sensibility and the loyalty and the love within the women of the Reivers was really strong. But some of these women did rise. You're talking like families were wiped out just like that. They could be there 1 minute and suddenly hundreds of them were gone, and someone has to jump up and pick it up, and that's what they would do. They would run and they would pick them up and they would come back and they'd be even stronger. I mean, the women, they were losing husbands and sons and daughters on such a high scale, and it was literally, you could be the most powerful family or aligned with the most powerful family 1 minute, the next minute it's gone. It's just gone because of a decision that's been made. And something that I want to I've put into my writing is to create a lot of strong women in it. I want to tell those stories, and kind of like, again, because history hasn't done it. History's it's all very much painted from a male perspective, and all the male characters, and it's like, so, and I know there were strong female characters out there, and I've invented a couple because they weren't particularly well documented. I've managed to find legends of this character, but I don't know a lot. So what I've done is I've taken like some ideas and I've got, right, I'm gonna make some characters. I'm gonna make some heroes and some villains within these stories that are women, because they were just as much a part of the Reivers and what was going on the Anglo borders and these debatable lands as the men were. In the books, they're just not talked about as much, which I think is a real shame.
You mentioned religion a bit earlier. The Reivers don't sound like a terribly Christian folk. How did the church deal with them? There was quite a famous curse, wasn't there?
Again, religion was changing. You could see that what was Henry's religion, that the invention of Protestantism, and Anglican. So that became Henry forced it, and it moved north, and it moved north, and it moved north, and it moved north. They were still God-fearing people. People were still God-fearing, and it didn't matter what they did. They still did what they did. And the churches tried to do the best that they could, even though they were kind of like, they would use it. The church was a powerful, powerful weapon. Religion was far more powerful to nations than I think it is to some nations now. It was really kind of like influential on how people led their lives. But the Reivers kind of like, the Reivers did what they did, for means of survival, and they might not have thought what they were doing was a bad thing, even though it was. And they would go to church, and they would attend the congregations all the time. They would be going to churches that these churches were paying protection rackets to. The churches had to pay protection as well, otherwise things would happen to the churches. Bits of the churches would vanish, members of the church would vanish, all of that sort of thing. But what happened is, so you've got Henry, who's instigating his Anglican religion and forcibly. And then what happened was, there was the Archbishop of Glasgow, a guy by the name of Dunbar. He was both infuriated with what the changes in religion, and anyone who he came across who had embraced the Anglican religion, he was murdering or torturing until they changed their ways. He thought the right way to deal with the Reivers would be to curse them. So what he wrote was a very long curse. It's pages upon pages of cursing the Reivers, and he curses everything about them, everything physically, everything spiritually, everything they own, everything that they are about. He curses it, and he does it individually. It's a long speech. And then what he did was he distributed that amongst his congregations and his churches, and it would have been handed to the priests of his church to read this out aloud within their churches, and basically excommunicating and banishing the Reivers, which must have been an absolutely terrifying thing for one of his priests to have to do, to stand up in front of a congregation that they will know and that they are dangerous of what they are capable of, and to openly curse them. And I can imagine the repercussions of that would have been huge. And you can say the cursed stone, it was turned into a cursed stone, is still in Carlisle. You can go and see it. You can bring the curse up, you can look it up on the web, and you can bring it up. And it's an interesting read. It goes into great detail about what he wants to curse about the Reivers. But it didn't have a lot of sway. I don't think anybody kind of took his words and obeyed them, basically.
There is something slightly Monty Python about the curse, in that it kind of curses every single inch of their bodies.
In reading it, that's exactly how it comes across. It's so ridiculous. And, you can see it from someone sat 100 miles away going, oh, well, this is what I'm going to do. This will show them. And then given to messengers and delivered to these kind of like small little congregations. And the faces of the priests when they read it out going, and I've got to do what? I have to read this out loud to really? Do you know what I mean? I have that for an idea for a future story. It's one of those, again, I've said to you, says, you come across stories that are so dark and so tragic, but you come across stories that are so funny, and that is up there with them in my mind. It's so ridiculous and so very British.
The other remarkable thing about the curse is that the very last bit of it basically says this curse is lifted if you repent. That if any Reiver who just went, all right, I'll stop reiving, the curse would be lifted. That's a seed for an interesting story. A Reiver who converts.
Again, that's another story. You can imagine, say, someone from a smaller family going to a bigger family going, oh, we won't be doing it anymore. We've decided to repent. And they go, okay. And then they wake up the next day and all their belongings are gone. So, it's like you were under the threat of so many people to live in that area. That's the tragic thing. Is like they had it coming from all areas. They had religion. They had power. They had the threat from the government, the threat from the monarchy, the threat from the church, the threat from themselves. If it had been me, I would have moved away. It's like, I'm surprised it was still so popular. I'm surprised it wasn't just waste grams. But, you're talking about, again, I keep coming back to that, not a lot of people know that. Do you know what I mean? And yet there's so much going on. It's like, and when we have reached out and we've found an audience with it, they just light up, when they hear these stories and go, but that's where I live. Yep, that's what happened. So like I was reading a story about a famous outlaw who's someone called Kilmot Willie, who was an Armstrong. And it mentioned he was wanted because he marched into Hayden Bridge, which was a village 7 miles away from where I grew up, and basically stole all the cattle, took the lot and took them back over the borders. Do you know what I mean? And that all happened. And then, and he became one of the most wanted outlaws in the land for a long time.
Just as you were saying about how kind of immediate it all is, that when you read out those names, there are a number of businesses up here. Fenwick's, Musgrave, Beatties. I mean, my family are the Beatties, and they're massive construction workers. Once they stopped actually reaving, they went legit, as it were, and Routledge, the big publishing company.
All of that, you know what I mean? It's when I went to school, when I was growing up in Tynedale, I knew most people had those names. There's not many people, there's none of them surnames where I can't think of someone that I knew growing up that had that surname, whether it was another kid in my class or whether it was just another family living in my town. There's all those names are there. All those names are there. And even growing up, it was a bit tricky. Do you know what I mean? Because as someone from Tynedale, if I decided to venture up into another part of the Northumberland, if we started going out, you know, there was still those rivalries still go on today. Do you know what I mean? You ask anyone who grew up in the 70s or the 80s in Northumberland, you go like, yeah, you can't go there. You don't want to be going there. Do you know what I mean? It's a very territorial part of the world, and you're talking within like 3 or 4 miles. This is our patch. It's a very interesting thing.
Well, Steve, that's absolutely brilliant. You really brought them to life. Just to sum up, what's the best place for people to find out about the Reivers if they want to do some research or just go down some rabbit holes?
There's books out there. So, you know, if you're part of a library, go and ask at the library and they'll have some stuff. You can find books and literature from like Amazon and this or that. But the best place to look is on the internet, and start with something as basic as, you know, Wikipedia, and look up Reivers. Also, if you have a family name, look that up, because chances are it'll connect to a Reiver site. If you type in Reivers, there's lots of websites out there. There's lots of places you can go. And what I love about it is that you'll look into something and it will take you down what is sometimes called a rabbit hole. Before you know it, you're exploring things and finding new things and finding out new things about your area, where you grew up, because chances are some fairly important things, again, if you live in the northeast of England, some very important things will have happened around where you live. But, you know, so start the internet or have a look around where you live. There may be buildings of that age that will have had some connections, you know, the big jails that where the Reivers were taken, obviously with Carlisle and Newcastle, you know, they were the big governing centres of kind of like the debatable lands, the borderlands. There's the old jail in Hexham, there's Carlisle Castle, so many stories around Carlisle Castle. But then even if you type in, you know, Reiver buildings, you know, they'll all come up and it'll tell you where they are, and it'll tell you a bit of history about them. You know, you can look up all the surnames, it'll tell you what the surnames are, it'll tell you who they're aligned to. If you type in Reiver family maps, it'll bring up, you can find a map of the whole of the northeast and Scotland and South Scotland, and it'll tell you where the families actually hailed from and the other families around them. So you can find where these things happened and where these partnerships built, because the families were together. So it's all out there, and that's how I found out. Let's say, you know, I knew very little, and it's only through going down these little rabbit holes and a little bit of research and a little bit of this and a little bit of that. And then you learn how to find it, you know. And I love it when I find out a new story. Or a little fact. I've always been a fan of history, but this part of history, and maybe it's because of affiliated, because it's from where I'm from. I'm getting beyond passion and obsession about, really. So good luck with it if it's something that you do, because it is brilliant.
Steve Byron, thank you very much. That was amazing.
Cheers, thank you.
That was writer and actor Steve Byron discussing the world of the Reivers. To find out more about Elysium's work, go to our website www.elysiumtc.co.uk.